sponsored by the Schiller Institute and the magazine Executive Intelligence Review. And just to inform those of you who may not know about us, the Executive Intelligence Review, of which you have in your packet, was founded by the American economist and former Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche. Actually, 40 years ago, this issue is starting the 40th year of publication. And the Schiller Institute was founded in 1984 at a time when there was a threat of a decoupling between the United States and Europe. Mr. LaRouche's wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the head of our European movement, decided that it were necessary to form an organization that could campaign for keeping the Western Alliance by both providing the Americans with the ideas of the European classical Renaissance and also provide the Europeans with the ideas of the American Revolution, the ideas of Republican form of government. But since that time, the Schiller Institute has gone from being an Atlantic association to being an international association. And we are meeting today at a very crucial period when the international financial system is collapsing and where there's a danger of war in the Middle East. And our topic today will be the Middle East. Will it be a trigger for a Third World War, or will it be an opportunity to engage in the type of massive economic development that could actually help bring the world out of the economic collapse? And our format today is that we will first have a speech about the international strategic situation, the war danger, from the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, Tom Gillesberg, who's also the EIR Copenhagen bureau chief. Then we'll have a few questions, and then afterwards we have our special guest, Hussein Askary, originally from Iraq, but living in Stockholm now, who is the head of our Swedish organization and is our Middle East correspondent. He also runs the Arabic homepage for the Schiller Institute and also is publishing articles on behalf of EIR and the Schiller Institute in the Arabic world. And in terms of our setup, we will only record the speeches by Tom and Hussein. And then for the discussion, we close down the recording equipment so there can be free, open discussion with no record, so people can feel free to speak their mind. So with that, I introduce Tom.
Thank you. So I'll just say that those that might not know the EIR magazine or Mr. LaRouche or the Schiller Institute already should just be aware that we have made it a habit of speaking very bluntly, of not playing diplomatic games, of trying to be nice to everybody simply for the purpose of being nice, but to the best of our ability to put the real issues on the table as truthful as possible in order to have a real discussion about how to get the world to move forward and how to solve the crises that the world is presently facing. So I might say some shocking things, and you should feel very welcome to take them up after the presentation in the discussion. But I will also, for those that do not know Mr. LaRouche, forewarn you that he has a tremendous record over the last over 40 years of coming out with some very dramatic predictions of an impending phase change in the world situation, and also especially in the financial situation, that at certain points throughout the history, Mr. LaRouche has said, like he said in 2007, that now we are standing at a phase change. Now the system as we know it will come down. And there's nothing that can be done to prevent that. And he said that in 2007. That's the crisis we have to deal with, and then put solutions on the table of how to deal with such a crisis in order to rebuild the world. Unfortunately, as I think you all are aware, out of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 was not coming a new policy. It was basically a continuation of the same policy, with the central banks of the world simply flooding the financial world with fresh money, but not with a change of policy. With the result that now, 5 years later, we stand again in the midst of a blowout of the global financial system. And where a lot of the solutions that was chosen before of simply printing money and pumping them out in the financial system, if it is still pursued, simply will have the effect of creating hyperinflation and simply flatten the system as we know it. So for that reason, Mr. LaRouche has been very active and in coming out with, you could say, at the last minute, proposals for a change in policy in the United States, and also propose a change in the global policy to make sure that there's a way out of this mess. Because on the one side we have this impending global financial blowout crisis we're in the midst of right now, but at the same time, parallel with that, we therefore also have a very real continuing threat of a global confrontation between the United States and Britain on the one side, Russia, China and others on the other side, which, if that is not resolved in a peaceful manner, will down the road lead to a thermonuclear war. And this is what we are seeing right now, the center of that debacle or that fight right now. That is what the Middle East right now is all about. You could say, as the Balkans before World War I was the place to make a mess in order to start World War, today the Middle East has inherited that position, and therefore it's very important what does happen or what does not happen in that region. Now, all of this, as we meet here today, it's actually the day after Obama was re-inaugurated in Washington for his second term in office. And as I'm sure you're all aware, none of these realities were discussed as part of that. If he had been Franklin D. Roosevelt, this would have been the theme of his inaugural address. That was not the case. We, on the contrary, are very committed to make sure that these very real issues are right now the center of attention in Washington. As we speak, and actually in the last, also before New Year, when the US Congress was in session, they were approaching the so-called financial cliff and were staying in session, we made sure that there was an intense debate, not on the pro forma issues of where should we cut what in order to fit, you know, the old suit, but what dramatic changes, you could even say revolutionary changes, has to be made in the US politics in order to give a way out. And that we are also doing as we're speaking right now. We have a lot of young, very talented people in our organization, and young they are now, most of them, I guess you say, young being under 40 at least, who is right now in Washington going through all the different congressional offices, the Senate, the offices of the different senators, engaging them in discussion on how to deal with this, and most emphatically, how to make sure that Barack Obama is not able to continue the policy we've seen the last 4 years, which will simply ruin the United States and the world permanently. Now there's two sides of this. On the strategic side, this week is actually, it's not the new period for Obama does not have a honeymoon. Already tomorrow, Hillary Clinton is to testify in front of both the House of Representatives and the Senate on what really happened in Benghazi, September 11th, 2012. How was it possible that an American ambassador and 3 CIA agents was killed in a terror incident? Basically by the same people, by the same networks that the United States has supported in getting into power in Libya. And that is a big story in the United States. You will find in this package, in the back of this Greater Mideast Trigger for War New Development Area, a timeline where it basically, this is where there's a timeline that is right now the talk of the town in Washington, which we have distributed, which we every other day update with new developments, basically showing how all these, how the takeover right now of parts of the Middle East, Northern Africa, by Al-Qaeda is made possible by the British-Saudi control of these Al-Qaeda operations, supporting them, securing also funding through Saudi Arabia, through Qatar, but that this whole takeover by these groups has been done with the active complicity of the Obama administration. And I mean, right now, of course, it's the focal point has moved to Mali, it moved to Algeria, to this latest kidnapping incidents. And this is all done with weapons coming from Libya. This is all done by the network that was supported by the United States, by NATO, in the Libya war, and which is presently supported in Syria to topple the government of Syria. And when you go through the details, which we have done, and this, if you go through the, again, even what is known in the public domain, there is also a very clear line from this takeover of terrorism right now back to the September 11th event of 2001, which was done by the same networks, basically, sponsored by Britain, by Saudi Arabia, which carried out this terrorist attack in the United States, and which were never held accountable for it. Where one of the big things, and this is all what might come up with the testimony of Hillary Clinton. This is what should come up with the testimony of Hillary Clinton. Both what has been going on now, the scandal now, but also going back to the fact that out of September 11, 2001, 9/11 as it's known, all records documenting the role of, among others, Saudi Arabia and especially Prince Bandar in setting up and running the whole operations was suddenly, first by Bush and later by Obama, classified. That is, that even the Congressional Oversight Board there was made a congressional report on the whole thing with 28 pages documenting this, which were then classified and is still being held as classified. Now, this is important to bear in mind in order to see the bigger picture of what is going on in the Middle East right now, because with the NATO bombardments in Libya, where, again, based basically on a lie in the UN Security Council, where it was said that in order to protect the people of Benghazi, we need a no-fly zone in Libya. as soon as there was no veto from Russia or from China or anybody else on that, that was converted into a very active regime change policy for Libya, which ended, as all know, with the murder of Gaddafi. Now, we know that what was the plan from these circles was to immediately continue from the war in Libya with a similar kind of war against Syria, against Iran. And at the same time, we know, as you all know, Russia came out with backing from China very explicitly and said, we will never once again accept that kind of thing that happened in Libya. We will not go along with that once more. And that confrontation, I mean, we've survived it the last year, that especially the US military has been actively engaged in doing all they could in order to prevent a war against Syria or against Iran. They are still doing so every day. We've had very active work by Russia with the same purpose. But it's still on the table. It has not been taken off the table in the US at present. And that is a big threat. Now, in order to see the bigger picture, it is also relevant to say, well, what is this really? Is this just about the Middle East? No. This is a question, what should the global policy be? In Europe and the United States, a paradigm has taken over of saying we no longer need development, we don't need nuclear power, we can have windmills, we can have zero growth, we can have all of this, no problem. The only problem being, of course, that in Asia, they have not adopted that paradigm. On the contrary, they negated it very strongly. Which means that Asia has continued forward with economic development, with an idea of developing the world. And that is what is creating this extreme tension and this threat for the world. Now, our proposal is that we end this tension by having a paradigm shift in the West, in the United States, in Europe, that we say, let's go from having this enforced non-development that we've seen in big parts of the world, and let's instead sit down at the table and put forward a global development agenda. Let's take the United States, China, Russia, India, make an agreement for global development and have all other countries jump in and do that. And do that, of course, both will solve the strategic crisis, but at the same time, that also means having a new global financial system that will both get us out of the present mess, but also make it possible to actually build up something for the future. Now, much more could be said on the strategic situation. This will be very dramatic in Washington. Already the confirmation hearings of Obama's cabinet will also have these things in there. Obama has proposed Bremer as the new head of the CIA. He is Mr. Drone Policy. He has been setting up the US policy of having drones running around killing people. Not declaring war, simply killing people. Which, of course, is unconstitutional in the United States. Only Congress can declare war, not the president. Including killing American citizens, which also is a very dramatic breach on the American Constitution. At the same time, also, it was just announced by Rand Paul in the Senate that he will, in the confirmation hearings and also on this whole hearing on Benghazi Gate, will be taking up the question, was there a fast and furious policy in the Arabic world? Like internally in the United States, there's this big scandal of the US Justice Department having delivered weapons to the drug cartels in Mexico. It's a huge scandal which we will hear much more of. But was there a parallel thing going on towards in the Middle East. At the same time, and again, it is to be emphasized, I mean, this has the potential of forcing Obama to resign if Hillary Clinton would say what she knows. Because this is such a blatant, not only breach of the Constitution, but also treason against the United States population, that a president might not survive that. So we might look on a dramatic different situation in Washington by the end of the week, depending on what comes out of these hearings. Now, this is running parallel to, as I said, the financial blowout, where a rerun of the crisis of 2007-2008 could come any day. There's been put out a lot of money for the banks and for the speculators, trillions of dollars, but none of this money has gone further from the banks to the real physical economy. So that means there's not been created any jobs with all of the money spent by the governments. There's not been made any change in policy. All what was done was keeping the present banks and the financial system afloat. And now we've come to a point where if even that is attempted for some months more, half a year, there's the immediate threat of a hyperinflation blowout. And that has created the circumstances where there is now, within many different circles, even in the financial world, becoming a very dramatic discussion of this. Koenig, who was formerly the head of the Federal Reserve in Kansas City, I think, who is now the second man in charge of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the United States, came out publicly over the last couple of days and says, we have to deal with this, we have to do something. We need Glass-Steagall on the table, a re-emergence of Franklin D. Roosevelt's law from 1933 that was taken out of business in 1999. It has to be put on the table again. Richard Fisher, who is presently the head of the Federal Reserve in Dallas, came out a couple of days ago with a very provocative speech in Washington, saying we have to deal with the banks now. We have to end the idea of banks that are too big to fail. They should not be protected by the US government anymore. We need to split them up. And he basically, in his speech, said we need to split them up in normal banking and investment banking, like was done with Franklin D. Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall law, even though he didn't say the name. And he even went so far to say, and then I propose that if you go into an investment bank, which is not sticking to simply have normal commercial banking activity under government protection, people should be signing a government agreement as they enter the bank, saying that they know that this bank is not covered and protected by the government. And he compared it to, he said, even like if you buy a package of cigarettes today, there's a warning that this package of cigarette might be a danger to your health and kill you. You need the same kind of warning people have to sign before they go into the bank. Now, as I said, this Glass-Steagall question is coming up very dramatically right now because those that are on the inside of the system knows that this is becoming the last moment. And on Mr. Fisher, I just want to note, it just came out yesterday from the transcripts of the Federal Reserve meetings 5 years ago, in June of 2007, which is now being made public. They have a 5-year clause on it. After 5 years, they begin to make public. There was actually yesterday coming out a report of a discussion in June 2007 of Federal Reserve, where Mr. Fisher went out and warned this Bear Stearns crisis. What are we going to do with this? We got to have a policy for how to deal with it. Everybody has to be on board. How do we deal with this? And where Geithner at the time went in, and who has been and resigns now as the Treasury Secretary, came out and said at the time, no, 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 we don't need that. There is not a crisis. And the same Geithner says that he foresees no danger of banks going under, any dramatic events coming. Mr. Fischer did. Like Mr. LaRouche at the time in the Schiller Institute, which he forewarned that this is big. He even said, I know from my own background in the investment banking community that this can be blown to the skies, and compared it to the long-term capital management which went under in 1998, I think, where because of the Russian state bond crisis at the time, this very respectable, huge investment fund busted basically overnight and endangered the whole global financial system. Now, so this is on the table, and what we right now do, therefore, in Washington, and the discussions that are going on is, how do we get out of this? Now, Mr. LaRouche has proposed a 3-point program as basically the only package which will give the United States a way out of this thing. That, and here you see Mr. LaRouche, who's also the founder, as Michel said, of the EIR magazine. The first point, number one, you've got to have a Glass-Steagall bank separation, where on the one side you have legitimate commercial banking activities, people deposit money in the bank, people lend money in the bank. This is absolutely necessary for having a functioning economy. This should be protected by the government, like the FDIC in the US. That part has to be there. But at the same time, we now in the financial system has a gigantic financial bubble of all kinds of horrid things, with an even greater amount of derivative contracts and who knows what out there that cannot be paid. Therefore, those two things has to be separated from each other. You have to put normal banking activity and says this is in one bank, the other things in the investment bank, and those two things cannot be done under the same roof. This was the policy imposed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. That's for what for many, many years prevented the kind of mess we have seen now after the Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, and you had this deregulation of the global financial system. Once you do this, though, you also take out a lot of money. Most of the money presently in the United States is in phony things. It's nothing. You have a lot of paper, a lot of electronic money, which has no physical backing, which means when you go in and separate the banks and you basically push the button and says anything that's not legitimate banking activity is not covered by the state anymore, we will see trillions and trillions of dollars go up in smoke, which is also why, of course, a lot of banks are against doing this and people having these fictitious money. Therefore, you have as a second step, if the United States is to survive, you have to go back to a national credit system. Yes, just to say with the Glass-Steagall law, as I said, this is a very, very hot issue right now in the United States, in the Congress. It was introduced by Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat, in the former Congress and got over 80 co-signers. It was not adopted into law in the old Congress, but has already been reissued as a new motion in the new Congress with the backing from Marcy Kaptur and with Walter Jones as the co-sponsor, and has already gaining tremendous support. And it was reported when Fischer made his speech on the necessity of bank divisions, he was getting a huge amount of calls, also from the Congress, from both Democrats and Republicans, saying we have to do something. You're right, something has to be done. So this is an issue on the table here and now. Now, as the second part, after Glass-Steagall, you have to have a way of generating credit. Not money, credit. That is, not money for the banks, not money to keep the bubbles afloat, but credits for the real physical economy, which creates real jobs, which rebuilds the nations. Now, the way that was done historically in the United States, from the inception of the United States, was that the government issued credit, which it then lent through a national bank to specific products which improved the productivity of the United States as a whole. General improvements, canals, river systems, roads, things that built the nation and thereby improved the wealth of the nation and thereby made it possible for the state, even though it issued more money in technical terms, to be able to honor those money in the future, because there was more wealth generated out of those money than the money produced, so to speak. And that has to happen, because without that, nothing will get started in the United States or in Europe when we do this. There will be no money for any project. Everybody will be broke. There will be no private banks that have a lot of money to lend out. So credit has to be created, but it has to be put into things which builds the nations and builds the economy. If for the United States, especially, number 3, this will then be used for, we don't have it here, for NAVAPA, North American Water and Power Agreement. A huge infrastructure project taking water down from Canada and the United States to all of the North American continent, which desperately lacks water. A project which in itself alone would create 6 million direct jobs and a lot more jobs coming from it. But this is a principle for everything. This goes for the world as a whole, which if we go back to the, it's okay, to this Eurasian land bridge, which is the same conception you can say on a global scale, massive infrastructure networks which unites nations, which not only improves trades, it's not only that, it's development corridors which develops the territory in depth and makes it possible to have a bigger population with a higher standard of living everywhere. So you need national projects and you need international continental projects. As I said, this policy right now, this is a fight going on in the States right now. We have taken it into Washington. It is now in Washington. That there has been a transformation in the discussions going on which makes this possible. It's not the same as it's, I can guarantee that it happens, unfortunately, but it's on the table because the United States is in a desperate situation. Now the same thing goes for Europe and the rest of the, and much other parts of the world. Europe right now is in big trouble. The euro can't survive in the present system. It's impossible. One might try to go into denial over it, but it's not possible that the euro survives in its present form. Right now in Europe, the policy is pump in money, let's save the banks, let's save the bank. All of these help aid projects we've seen for Greece, we've seen for Portugal, for Spain, one for Ireland, one coming up for Italy. None of that had to do with aiding the populations in those countries or those nations as such. It was all a matter of saving some banks which were sitting out on the other side, which would go bust if those loans and debts were not honored. So the people, the population has been sacrificed for the sake of temporarily saving the bank. Now this cannot continue. Already now we are at a breaking point where social chaos and even war breaks out if this is continuously imposed in Greece, in Spain. Nations that, like Spain right now, might dissolve if this is pushed. And even in the midst of this, the people that are enforcing the policy themselves. As you all know, in Europe, it's the famous troika of the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Union coming in dictating the policies to the different nations. The IMF economists that has been involved in this actually came out 10 days ago in an article in Washington Post with what they call a mea culpa, basically saying, we made a mistake. The policies we have been imposing on Greece has been a disaster. They are not working. With the kind of cutbacks we made in everything, we're collapsing the economy. It was a mistake. It does not work. But what happened over the last couple of days, the new proposals for the IMF came out for what Greece should do in the future, which was more of the same policy. So this has to change. There has to be a paradigm shift on this. And this has a lot to do with what Hussein is going to present for the Middle East. We made also a development plans for Southern Europe as a way of changing this policy and giving us a way out. Also yesterday it was announced, and I think it's very relevant in this discussion, that the Independent Greeks Party in Greece has filed a case at the International Criminal Court against the three key negotiating persons from the IMF, the European Union, and the European Central Bank, demanding that they are being held accountable for this crime against the population of Greece, where they say we've seen 3,500 suicides as a result of this policy, 1.5 million people extra unemployed. This is against the protection of basic human rights and fundamental freedom. Now, and that, again, is a question that has to be put on the table, that this policy that we've been, the solution over the last 5 years, has been a disaster which is right now killing nations, killing people, and it has to be changed. So we need a paradigm shift with this three-point program of Mr. LaRouche. The United States is key, of course, because of the power the United States holds in the world today. If the US changes policy, it will be much, much easier for the rest of the world to do so. But that does not mean, as we see it, that Denmark, where we're sitting now, and other countries should sit passively and, wait for the United States doing something. If we want to survive, we right now have to go with the same kind of policy change in order to have a defense against the flooding, the tsunami that's already on its way, that's going to wipe out much of what we have today if nothing is done. So getting the Glass-Steagall on the table, but doing that in the different nations also has a very big impact, even in the United States. That these kind of policies being discussed around the world does also impact what's going to end up happening in the United States. So I will say the time is too short right now, with what we are standing in front of, to be a coward or a pragmatist on this. You have to make sure you do whatever you can to make this change. Of course, if you do it, LaRouche has been very out with this before, in the United States, if the United States government would decide to do so, to change policy, and say, we engage, we take a direct collaboration with Russia, with China, also India, maybe not in the first round, but in the second round, China and Russia would immediately be ready to engage in a collaboration, both on strategic issues and on reorganizing the global financial system based on national sovereignty and a collaboration between sovereign nation states. And once the United States, Russia, and China does so, India tagging along, of course, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, everybody else will of course, join in. And then, instead of simply figuring out how are we going to eradicate mankind, then immediately with such a collaboration, other things are on the table. The Russian government has proposed as a counter-proposal to the policy from the United States and from the European Union of deploying a missile defense systems around the world that is being put up in Turkey, different other places. The Russian government has said, this is totally wrong, we're against this. This is a part of this is a threat to our ability to retaliate against a nuclear attack, and we therefore have to take preventive measures in order to make sure we do not end up being eradicated. But at the same time, as a counter-proposal, Russia said, let's instead collaborate on a strategic defense of Earth. Yes, while nuclear missiles running loose is a problem. Let's deal with that. Let's make a system which can take them out of action. Let's collaborate between the United States and Russia and others on doing that, like Ronald Reagan proposed with the SDI policy in 1983. Let's make that real. But at the same time, let's not just deal with the threats against the planet coming from something on Earth. We have a very direct threat also coming from outer space. All the time, asteroids get in orbit close to the Earth. Now, last thing I was in when was this? The last big one hit in Siberia. I think it was in 1908 or something like that. It's some time ago. Seen in the time we do. We know from the historical records of Earth, sometimes the Earth is hit by some very nasty object, which if they would hit, would eradicate mankind. We also know that the kind of thing which hit in 1908, had it hit a major city instead of hitting an empty place in Siberia, that would have been able to take out the greater Los Angeles or New York or Copenhagen or whatever. Something very nasty. Now, these asteroids out there, they're going to hit us, some smaller, some bigger. We therefore have to prepare for that and make sure we can deal with that. And that is not something you do as one nation by itself. This is by its nature something which is fittingly dealt with by mankind as such. And that kind of collaboration is very ingenious by the Russians, and therefore is directly a path you can move forward. So I will end just by saying that right now the choice is, are we going to let the follies of the past determine the destruction of mankind, or are we instead going to look to the future generations and right now take the actions which will make them proud of what we have done?